Check. Alright, guys, hey, it's William again. And like most people who spend a lot of time on the internet, I've heard a lot about J.K. Rowling. She's the devil. She's not so bad. She's really anti trans. She's a crazy feminist. She's a TERF, which is a word that trans people call feminists who don't support them. And honestly, I'm not very well read on it. So I'm going to read a long essay today that J.K. Rowling wrote on the subject. J.K. Rowling writes about her reasons for speaking out on sex and gender issues. So, like me, I think a lot of you haven't read this either. So let's just read it together and see what she actually says, and if all these people calling her transphobic are right or wrong, or somewhere in between. So I'm just going to read this and take a listen, okay? This isn't an easy piece to write, for reasons that will shortly become clear. But I know it's time to explain myself on an issue surrounded by toxicity. I write this without any desire to add to that toxicity. For people who don't know, last December I tweeted my support for Maya Forstater, a tax specialist who'd lost her job for what were deemed transphobic tweets. She took her case to an employment tribunal, asking the judge to rule on whether a philosophical belief that sex is determined by biology is protected in law. Judge Taylor ruled that it wasn't. So far, it just seems like she was protecting a woman that got fired for something. Alright? My interest in trans issues predated Maya's case by almost 2 years, during which I followed the debate around the concept of gender identity closely. I've met trans people and read sundry books, blogs, and articles by trans people, gender specialists, intersex people, psychologists, safeguarding experts, social workers, and doctors, and followed the discourse online and in traditional media. On one level, my interest in this issue has been professional, because I'm writing a crime series set in the present day, and my fictional female detective is of an age to be interested in and affected by these issues herself. But on another, it's intensely personal, as I'm about to explain. All this time, I've been researching and learning accusations and threats from trans activists have been bubbling in my Twitter timeline. This was initially triggered by a like. When I started taking an interest in gender identity and transgender matters, I began screenshotting comments that interested me, as a way of reminding myself what I might want to research later. On one occasion, I absent-mindedly liked instead of screenshotting. That single like was deemed evidence of wrongthink. So here's an Orwellian term she's using from 1984. And a persistent low level of harassment began. Months later, I compounded my accidental like crime by following Magdalene Burns on Twitter. Magdalene was an immensely brave young feminist and lesbian who was dying of an aggressive brain tumor. I followed her because I wanted to contact her directly, which I succeeded in doing. However, as Magdalene was a great believer in the importance of biological sex, and didn't believe lesbians should be called bigots for not dating trans women with penises, dots were joined in the heads of Twitter trans activists, and the level of social media abuse increased. So again, it seems like she's just protecting women and LGBT women at that. Alright? I mention all this time only to explain that I knew perfectly well what was going to happen when I supported Maya. I must have been on my 4th or 5th cancellation by then. I expected the threats of violence to be told I was literally killing trans people with my hate. To be called bad language, to be called the C word and the B word, and of course, for my books to be burned, although one particularly abusive man told me he'd composted them. What I didn't expect in the aftermath of my cancellation was the avalanche of emails and letters that came showering down upon me, the overwhelming majority of which were positive, grateful, and supportive. They came from a cross-section of kind, empathetic, and intelligent people, some of them working in fields dealing with gender dysmorphia and trans people, who are all deeply concerned about the way a socio-political concept is influencing politics. medical practice, and safeguarding. They're worried about the dangers to young people, gay people, and about the erosion of women's and girls' rights. Above all, they're worried about a climate of fear that serves nobody, least of all trans youth, well. So guys, for me, this is where I chime in. I'm a conservative as of late, and the only issue I have is that it infringes on women's rights. If you want to play sports and not get beat up on by a guy, that's your right as a woman, and I as a man want to protect that right. So J.K. is saying that. I'd stepped back from Twitter for many months, both before and after tweeting support for Maya, because I knew it was doing nothing good for my mental health. I only returned because I wanted to share a free children's book during the pandemic. Immediately, activists who clearly believe themselves to be good, kind, and progressive people swarmed back into my timeline, assuming a right to police my speech, accuse me of hatred, call me misogynistic slurs, and above all, as every woman involved in this debate will know, TERF. I mentioned this one earlier. I just learned about it the other day as well. If you didn't already know, and why should you, TERF is an acronym coined by trans activists, which stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist. Just in case I have any younger people here who don't have a great grasp on English yet, trans exclusionary means like everything except trans. So like we support this excluding trans. So TERF. In practice, a huge and diverse cross-section of women are currently being called TERFs, and the vast majority have never been radical feminists. Examples of so-called TERFs range from the mother of a gay child who was afraid their child wanted to transition to escape homophobic bullying, to a hitherto totally unfeminist older lady who's vowed never to visit Marks and Spencer's again because they were allowing any man who says they identify as a woman into the women's changing rooms. Ironically, radical feminists aren't even trans exclusionary. They include trans men in their feminism because they were born women. I think that is her trying to take a dig at the other side. That was just kind of funny, I think. So they do support trans, just, biologically female trans people. But accusations of TERFery have been sufficient to intimidate many people, institutions, and organizations I once admired, who are cowering before the tactics of the playground. They'll call us transphobic. They'll say I hate trans people. What next? They'll say you've got fleas. Speaking as a biological woman, a lot of people in position of power really need to grow a pair, which is doubtless literally possible, according to the kind of people who argue that clownfish prove humans are a dimorphic species. I don't really get the joke on that one. So why am I doing this? Why speak up? Why not quietly do my research and keep my head down? Well, I've got 5 reasons for being worried about the new trans activism and deciding I need to speak up. Alright. Firstly, I have a charitable trust that focuses on alleviating social deprivation in Scotland, with a particular emphasis on women and children. Among other things, my trust supports projects for female prisoners and for survivors of domestic and sexual abuse. I also fund medical research into MS, a disease that behaves very differently in men and women. It's been clear to me for a while that the new trans activism is having, or is likely to have, if all demands are met, a significant impact on many of the causes I support, because it's been pushing to erode the legal definition of sex and replace it with gender. So her first reason is she has a lot of social programs that help women, for the most part, women and children, and, female prisoners. If a guy goes to prison and says he's a girl, maybe he's getting beat up or maybe he's getting, raped by the other guys, he can just claim to be a girl and go in with the women. So, that's dangerous for the women. The second reason is that I'm an ex-teacher. I'm a teacher. And the founder of a children's charity, which gives me an interest in both education and safeguarding. Like many others, I have deep concerns about the effect the trans rights movement is having on both. The third is that as a much-banned author, I'm interested in freedom of speech and have publicly defended it, even unto Donald Trump. So guys, here's an interesting thing here. Whenever people are anti-trans, they assume that the person is pro-Trump. She is very anti-Trump. She's not a Trump supporter and has never been. But she is a fan of free speech. I'm a fan of free speech. I think burning the American flag is the most beautiful freedom that we have. I think burning any nation's flag is great because it shows that that nation is tolerant and free. And what's interesting, back in the 90s and 2000s when she was initially releasing these books, it was the conservative Christians that were burning her books. So she has had her books burned by conservative Christians and now, like, liberal, trans, lefty type people. So she's been hated by all. She's not one or the other. The fourth is where things truly start to get personal. I'm concerned about a huge explosion in young women wishing to transition and also about the increasing number who seem to be detransitioning, returning to their original sex, because they regret taking steps that have, in some cases, altered their bodies irrevocably and taken away their fertility. Some say they decided to transition after realizing they were same-sex attracted. That's called gay, I think. That's gay. And that transitioning was partly driven by homophobia, either in society or in their families. See, that's what I'm really feeling lately. I think trans is the new gay conversion therapy. No, my little boy's not gay. He's just a girl. And I don't know how I feel about it, honestly. All right, down here. Most people probably aren't aware, I certainly wasn't until I started researching this issue properly, that 10 years ago, the majority of people wanting to transition to the opposite sex were male. That ratio has now reversed. The UK has experienced a 4,400% increase in girls being referred to transitioning treatment. Autistic girls are hugely overrepresented in their numbers. So it's saying here, like, the large majority of people that are interested in this kind of lifestyle are autistic, which is means you're neurotypical. You're not mentally normal, is that what it means in common speak? All right. The same phenomena has been seen in the U.S. In 2018, American physician and researcher Lisa Littman set out to explore in an interview, she said, parents online were describing a very unusual pattern of transgender identification where multiple friends and even entire friend groups became transgender identified at the same time. I would have been remiss had I not considered social contagion and peer influences as potential factors. Littman mentioned Tumblr, Reddit, Instagram, and YouTube as contributing factors to rapid onset gender dysmorphia, ROGD, right? Where she believes that in the realm of transgender identification, youth have created particularly insular echo chambers. Okay? Her paper caused a furor. She was accused of bias and of spreading misinformation about transgender people, subjected to a tsunami of abuse and a concerted campaign to discredit both her and her work. The journal took the paper offline and re-reviewed it before publishing it. However, her career took a similar hit to that suffered by Maya Forstater. Lisa Littman had dared challenge one of the central tenets of trans activism, which is that a person's gender identity is innate, like sexual orientation. Let me read that again. What does that mean? So she dared challenge the central tenets of trans activism, which is that a person's gender identity is innate, like sexual orientation. All right? Nobody, the activists insisted, could ever be persuaded into being trans. Okay, so the trans activists, the pro-trans people are saying you're born with it, like with gay. That's what I think about gay, and that's pretty much scientifically proven. You're born gay. So J.K. Rowling is saying that people choose to be trans, okay? The argument of many current trans activists is that if you don't let a gender dysmorphic teenager transition, they will kill themselves. In an article explaining why he resigned from Tavistock, an NHS gender clinic in England, NHS is National Health Service, for those that don't know, psychiatrist Marcus Evans stated that claims that children will kill themselves if not permitted to transition, do not align substantially with any robust data or studies in this area, nor do they align with the cases I have encountered over decades as a psychotherapist. So, one professional, and that's the problem nowadays, we have tons of professionals, all these people with credentials and PhDs, saying one thing and another. So everything is true and untrue at the same time. It's really a crazy time we live in. It's truly post-information world. All right? The writings of a young trans men The writings of a young trans men reveal a group of notably sensitive and clever people. The more of their accounts of gender dysmorphia I've read, with their insightful description of anxiety, disassociation, eating disorders, self-harm, and self-hatred, the more I've wondered whether I'd been born 30 years earlier, I too might have tried to transition. That's a powerful statement right there. I mean, who as a teenager hasn't felt anxiety, disassociation, eating disorders, self-harm, self-hatred? Maybe 2 or 3 out of those. Even the most normal person you know has felt 2 of those. The average person, probably 3. And anyone that's kind of like weird or messed up, probably all of them. Okay? The allure of escaping womanhood would have been huge. I struggled with severe OCD as a teenager. If I'd found a community and sympathy online that I couldn't find in my immediate environment, I believe I could have been persuaded to turn myself into the son my father had openly said he'd have preferred. Right, that's a strong paragraph. When I read about the theory of gender identity, I remember how mentally sexless I felt in youth. I remember Colette's description of herself as a mental hermaphrodite, and in Simone de Beauvoir's words, it is perfectly natural for the future woman to feel indignant at the limitations posed upon her by her sex. The real question is not why she should reject them. The problem is rather to understand why she accepts them. I'm not going to dig into that. I don't really understand what that means. As I didn't have a realistic possibility of becoming a man back in the 1980s, it had to be books and music that got me through my mental health issues and the sexualized scrutiny and judgment that sets so many girls to war against their bodies and their teens. Alright, so it sounds to me like J.K. was just kind of, not asexual, but just not a super horny teenager. And that made her question her womanhood. Like, she said if she'd been born in this modern world, she'd be like, well, I'm not into guys. Maybe I'm a guy. Alright. Fortunately for me, I found my own sense of otherness and my ambivalence about being a woman, reflected in the work of female writers and musicians who reassured me that in spite of everything a sexist world tries to throw at the female-bodied, it's fine not to feel pink, frilly, and compliant inside your own head. It's okay to feel confused, dark, both sexual and non-sexual, unsure of what or who you are. I want to be very clear here. I know transition will be a solution for some gender dysmorphic people, although I'm also aware through extensive research that studies have consistently shown that between 60 to 90% of dysmorphic teens will grow out of their dysmorphia. Again and again, I've been told to just meet some trans people. In addition to a few younger people who are all adorable, I happen to know a self-described transsexual woman who's older than I am and wonderful. Although she's open about her past as a gay man. She was a gay man. Alright. I've always found it hard to think of her as anything other than a woman. Alright. And I believe and certainly hope she's completely happy to have transitioned. Being older, though, she went through a long and rigorous process of evaluation, psychotherapy, and stage transformation. The current explosion of trans activism is urging a removal of almost all the robust systems through which candidates for sex reassignment were once required to pass. A man who intends to have no surgery and take no hormones, so that would be just a guy like me, he just grow your hair, I guess, may now secure himself a gender recognition certificate and be a woman in the sight of the law. Many people aren't aware of this. We're living through the most misogynistic period I've experienced. Back in the 80s, I imagined that my future daughters, should I have any, would have it far better than I ever did. But between the backlash against feminism and a porn-saturated online culture, I believe things have got significantly worse for girls. Never have I seen women denigrated and dehumanized to the extent they are now. From the leader of the free world's long history of sexual assault accusations and his proud boast of grabbing them by the pee, to the incel, involuntarily celibate movement that rages against women who don't give them sex, to the trans activists who declare that TERFs need punching and re-educating. See, that's the problem with a lot of people on the left and right. When you dehumanize someone, you can punch them because they're a Nazi. It's okay to punch Nazis. Men across the political spectrum seem to agree. Women are asking for trouble. How everywhere, women are being told to shut up and sit down or else. See, again, I agree with JK on most of the trans stuff she said, but when she just started bashing men and saying that we're all jerks, I disagree. So again, everyone is on the spectrum. She believes things that I believe in, and I believe things that she doesn't believe in. There's overlap. I've read all the arguments about femaleness not residing in the sexed body and the assertion that biological women don't have common experiences, and I find them, too, deeply misogynistic and regressive. It's also clear that one of the objectives of denying the importance of sex is to erode what some seems to see as the cruelly segregationalist idea of women having their own biological realities, or, just as threateningly, unifying realities that make them a cohesive political class. The hundreds of emails I've received in the last few days prove this erosion concerns many others just as much. It isn't enough for women to be trans allies. Women must accept and admit that there is no material difference between trans women and themselves. So again, for anyone that isn't super aware on this, trans woman just means like changed into a woman. So that means biological male. So basically just flip it. And I don't really like this thing here, trans allies. I've seen this a few other places, like black allies. Like, when white people are considered, like, good, like, certain minority groups will call us allies. It's like, it just sounds weird. I don't like it. But as many women have said before to me, woman is not a costume. Woman is not an idea in a man's head. Woman is not a pink brain, a liking for Jimmy Choos, or any of the other sexist ideas now somehow touted as progressive. Moreover, the inclusive language that calls female people menstruators and people with vulvas strikes many women as dehumanizing and demeaning. I understand why trans activists consider the language to be appropriate and kind, but for those of us who have had degrading slurs spat at us by violent men, it's not neutral, it's hostile and alienating. Yeah, I really don't like that either. Like, she doesn't want to be called someone with a vulva, someone who menstruates, because there's a word for that. It's just called a woman. Like, whenever someone calls me, like, cisgender, it's like, that means you identify, like, I'm a guy physically and I'm a guy mentally. Cisgender, that's what that means. It's like, I'm not cisgender, you're transgender. Like, when 99.97% of the world is cisgender, you don't need to call it anything. It's just called normal. I mean, I'm sorry if that's rude, but that's what it's called. I'm not cisgender. I'm just a normal, healthy adult. You're trans. I'm not cis. All right, which brings me to a fifth reason I'm deeply concerned about the consequences of the current trans activism. I've been in the public eye now for over 20 years and have never talked publicly about being a domestic abuse and sexual assault survivor. This isn't because I'm ashamed those things happen to me, but because they're traumatic to revisit and remember. I also feel protective of my daughter from my first marriage. I didn't want to claim sole ownership of a story that belongs to her too. However, a short while ago, I asked her how she'd feel if I were publicly honest about that part of my life, and she encouraged me to go ahead. I'm mentioning these things now, not in an attempt to garner sympathy, but out of solidarity with a huge number of women who have histories like mine, who've been slurred as bigots for having concerns about single-sex spaces. I managed to escape my first violent marriage with some difficulty, but I'm now married to a truly good and principled man, safe and secure in ways I never in a million years expected to be. Probably because you're rich. Like, if I was married to a billionaire, I'd be a really, really good guy. However, the scars left by violence and sexual assault do not disappear. No matter how loved you are, and no matter how much money you've made, my perennial jumpiness is a family joke. And even I know it's funny. But I pray my daughters never have the same reasons I do for hating sudden loud noises, or finding people behind me when I haven't heard them approaching. Alright? If you could come inside my head and understand what I feel, see, that's what the minority groups always say, like, you need to see what we've been through. You need to see what we've been through. J.K. Rowling wants you to see what she has been through. It's all about understanding each other, then we won't be jerks. Let's see. Understand what I feel when I read about a trans... Oh, if you come inside my head and understand what I feel when I read about a trans woman dying at the hands of a violent man... So, trans woman... Alright. You'd find solidarity and kinship. I have a visceral sense of the terror in which those trans women will have spent their last seconds on Earth, because I too have known moments of blind fear when I realized that the only thing keeping me alive was the shaky self-restraint of my attacker. She is a good writer. You just feel that, like, viscerally. Like, oh man. The only reason she's still alive is because, like, the shaky self-restraint of the person beating her to death. That is good writing, JK. Nice. All right. I believe the majority of trans-identified people not only pose zero threat to others, but are vulnerable for all the reasons I've outlined. Trans people need and deserve protection. Like women, they're most likely to be killed by sexual partners. Trans women who work in the sex industry, particularly trans women of color, are at a particular risk. Like every other domestic abuse and sexual assault survivor I know, I feel nothing but empathy and solidarity with trans women who've been abused by men. All right. So I want trans women to be safe. At the same time, I do not want to make natal girls and women less safe. Natal girls? I guess that means biological girls. When you throw open the doors of bathrooms and changing rooms to any man who believes or feels he's a woman, and as I've said, gender confirmation certificates may now be granted without any need for surgery or hormones, then you open the door to any and all men who wish to come inside. That is the simple truth. See, now I'm going to have to agree with trans people for a moment here. I feel like her saying, like, the gender confirmation certificates, like, oh, that's the only reason I don't like it. I feel like even if you're on hormones and have already been, like, to the operation room, she would still not want you in the bathroom with her. I feel like that's kind of an excuse she's using. But let's see. On Saturday morning, I read that the Scottish government is proceeding with its controversial gender recognition plans, which will in effect mean that all a man needs to become a woman is to say he's one. To use a very contemporary word, I was triggered, ground down by the relentless attack from trans activists on social media when I was only there to give children feedback about a picture they'd drawn from my book under lockdown. I spent much of Saturday in a very dark place inside my head as memories of serious sexual assault I suffered in my 20s recurred on a loop. That assault happened at a time and in a space where I was vulnerable and a man capitalized on an opportunity. I couldn't shut out those memories, and I was finding it hard to contain my anger and disappointment about the way I believe my government is playing fast and loose with women and girls' safety. Alright guys, we're almost finished. Although I'm sure no one is still here. If you are actually watching this part of the video, I will send you a PlayStation 5, right? Send me a PlayStation 5. I'm a man of my word. Do it, okay? This only applies for 48 hours after posting. Late on Saturday evening, scrolling through the children's pictures before I went to bed, I forgot the first rule of Twitter. Never, ever expect a nuanced conversation, and reacted to what I felt was degrading language about women. I spoke up about the importance of sex, like meaning biological sex, and have been paying the price ever since. I was transphobic. I was a C word. I was a B word. I was a TERF. I deserved canceling, punching, and death. You are Voldemort, said one person, clearly feeling this was the only language I'd understand. It would be so much easier to tweet the approved hashtags because of course trans rights are humans' rights, and of course trans lives matter. Scoop up the woke cookies. See, again, like, I love how J.K. can, like, disagree and agree with me. Like, she's making fun of woke culture and she hates Trump. Like, she's all over the place. It's cool. She's not just one-sided. Scoop up the woke cookies and bask in the virtue signaling afterglow. There's joy, relief, and safety in conformity. As Simone de Beauvoir also wrote, without a doubt, it is more comfortable to endure blind bondage than to work for one's liberation. The dead, too, are better suited to the earth than the living. Huge numbers of women are justifiably terrified by the trans activists. I know this because so many have got in touch with me to tell me their stories. They're afraid of doxing. Doxing, again, I barely knew this a month ago. I'm not saying you don't know this, but I didn't, so I'm sure there's others that don't. Doxing is when you, like, publicly post someone's address and job and their children's information and schools and addresses online. Doxing. Or losing their jobs or their livelihoods and of violence. But endlessly unpleasant as its constant targeting of me has been, I refuse to bow down to a movement that I believe is doing demonstrable harm in seeking to erode woman as a political and biological class and offering cover to predators like few before it. See, like, yes, there's going to be some predators, like even real trans people who do some bad things to girls in a bathroom, And there is going to be people that just pretend to be trans to do bad things to girls in bathrooms. But the overwhelming majority of guys and girls that want to go to the bathrooms that they believe in are just confused. I mean, gender dysmorphia is a real thing. So, I mean, I'm personally okay with them going to the bathroom because you can't really see or do anything in a bathroom. I mean, just let them go to the bathroom. But I don't want them beating up on girls in sports and stealing scholarships. So, again, you can just be on different sides. All right. Like few before it, I stand alongside the brave women and men, gay, straight, and trans, who are standing up for freedom of speech and thought. Yes. And for the rights and safety of some of the most vulnerable in our society, young gay kids, fragile teenagers, and women who are reliant on and wish to restrain their single-sex spaces. Polls show those women are in the vast majority and exclude only those privileged or lucky enough to never have come up against male violence or sexual assault, and who've never troubled to educate themselves on how prevalent it is. All right, almost done. The one thing that gives me hope is that the women who can protest and organize are doing so, and they have some truly decent men and trans people alongside them. Political parties seeking to appease the loudest voices in this debate are ignoring women's concerns at their peril. In the UK, women are reaching out to each other across party lines, concerned about the erosion of their hard-won rights and widespread intimidation. None of the gender-critical women I've talked to hate trans people, or on the contrary. Many of them became interested in this issue in the first place out of concern for trans youth, and they're hugely sympathetic towards trans adults who simply want to live their lives, but who are facing a backlash for a brand of activism they don't endorse. Alright, so JK is saying, like, the radical trans people are, like, hijacking the movement to do some crazy things, and they're actually hurting the more mainstream trans people. Alright? The supreme irony is that the attempt to silence women with the word TERF may have pushed more young women towards radical feminism than the movement's seen in decades. Yeah, if you make fun of people and call them a TERF, they're either going to become a radical feminist or like a Trump supporter. Like, you're not going to get their desired result by making fun of people. The last thing I want to say is this. I haven't written this essay in the hope that anybody will get out a violin for me, not even a teeny-weeny one. I'm extraordinarily fortunate. I'm a survivor, certainly not a victim. I've only mentioned my past before, like every human being. I've only mentioned my past because, like every other human being on this planet, I have a complex backstory which shapes my fears, my interests, and my opinions. I never forget that inner complexity when I'm creating a fictional character, and I certainly never forget it when it comes to trans people. All I'm asking, all I want, is for similar empathy, similar understanding, to be extended to the many millions of women whose sole crime is wanting their concerns to be heard without receiving threats and abuse. Alright, we're finished. Great. So that was my reading of JK's quite long essay. I don't know how long I've been reading. I'm sure there's no one here at this point, probably not even my mother. And I was planning on just reading it straight through and then giving my thoughts, but I was just giving my thoughts along. So yeah, I'm not a bigot. I don't hate anyone. I'm just protecting biological women because men are physically stronger than girls. That is a fact. If a girl changes into a guy and wants to play sports, if she can even make the team, go for it. You are really cool. Great job. But I don't think guys like me should be able to play against girls. I mean, I'm not good at sports, so they'd probably still beat me. But I'd be like a medium-level athlete at least. All right, so anyways, we're all done here. Thank you for listening, guys.